Oh, allergies are really bad right now. The Jesuits do not want me to read this. This is part 2 of prenuptial agreement between Brent Spiner and Gail Chord Schuler. If any spouse has had willing and knowing sex with someone other than his or her spouse and was not driven to do so by an abusive spouse, that spouse is an unfaithful spouse as defined by this document. Obviously, someone who is a victim of rape, including drug rape, is not an unfaithful spouse. Division of property. Gail and her soon-to-be ex-husband will divide their property however they agree at the time of marriage dissolution, except that items that are more likely to be used by or needed by one party over the other, such as a piano, which only Gail could play, would be granted to the party that is more likely to use or need that property. If there is a dispute over which party needs a certain property, the courts can decide which party has the greater need for the property, and the property will be given to the party that has the greater need. This includes a house, a car, etc. One thing to take into consideration in division of property is the need to make payments, mortgage, car payments, etc. One party may not be able to afford the payments, mortgage, car payments, etc., in which case it may be best to give it to the party that can afford it. Or if one party has a real need for the property but can't afford the payments, or if the property is extravagant, it could be replaced with a property of lesser value but still useful. First, the need for the property must be determined. If the party that has the greatest need can't afford the property but needs to make payments on the property, but can't afford to make payments, then alimony payments that cover the payments for the property should be allowed if the other spouse can afford to make payments. In cases where neither spouse can afford to make payments, then the property can be given to the party that has the greatest need, and that party must decide whether to agree to accept the property or to refuse the property. If they agree to accept the property in this case, they will be responsible for all payments of the property and can't fault the other party if they fail to make payments. If the property is refused by both parties because neither wants to make payments, both must sell the property as soon as possible and divide the proceeds evenly between the parties. If the property is extravagant and the alimony payments would be outrageous to cover payments, then the property needs to be replaced with a property of lesser value, but that will still do the job, and the party that is granted the extravagant property will be awarded alimony to make payments on the extravagant property for a reasonable amount of time needed to sell or replace the property with a property of lesser value that will still do the job. Evidence must be provided by the party granted alimony to make payments on his or her extravagant property that he or she is doing all in his or her power to sell the property to replace it with a property of lesser value that will still do the job, or he or she will lose the right to receive alimony payments for their extravagant but temporarily needed property. Should either party decide that they want to forfeit their right to a certain property and allow the other to have that property, they can agree to this in writing at the time of marriage dissolution. Division of monies and assets. Those monies and assets that have been earned primarily by the efforts of one spouse over the other spouse will be granted to the spouse that put the most effort into earning those assets. However, if both spouses have played a role in earning those assets or monies, then if there is a dispute over the percentages or how much each put into those assets, the courts or a legal arbitrator will determine the percentage of effort that each spouse put into earning those monies and assets, and then after that percentage is determined, the percentage of effort that the spouse put into earning that asset or monies will be the percentage rewarded to the spouse after the marriage dissolution. Once an agreement over percentages is reached, that agreement and the percentages agreed upon will be put in writing and signed and dated by both parties with witnesses. Exception. If, for whatever reason, one spouse could not play a role in earning monies or assets for the family due to health problems, other than those health problems caused by attempted suicide, or by mental illness, or by extreme negligence, or if a spouse could or did not play a role in earning monies or assets due to a mutual decision by both spouses at the time of their marriage that one spouse should stay more at home than the others and therefore not bring any or much income into the family, while the other earned money from a job other than that of homemaker or parent, then the spouse that stayed more at home and could not or did not bring in any or much income, while the other could advance his or her career, will be awarded monies and assets that are compatible to the income that this stay-at-home spouse could have earned if he or she continued his or her job in the workplace, in a job comparable to his or her skills and or abilities. If that spouse, after the marriage dissolution, has a need for income to meet basic expenses as defined by this document. The basic premise of this prenuptial agreement is that if there is no need because basic needs are met, then no monies from the incomes or inheritances of either ex-spouse will be granted to the other ex-spouse other than those monies and assets they have already earned through their own incomes, savings, or inheritances. If both parties have money saved together in any type of savings or assets, they will be divided to each spouse according to the amount that each contributed to the account, or an amount mutually agreed upon by both parties. If there is a dispute over how much each contributed, this will be decided by the courts or a legal arbitrator. Monies paid into retirement accounts belong to the persons who have the accounts, regardless of who paid into them. If the spouse stayed more at home and did earn income from a career that did not penalize his or her income, because he or she stayed at home, because this spouse had a career not affected by his or her decision to stay more at home, such as being a successful writer who earned enough income to clothe, feed, and take care of himself, herself, or her family, then for the purposes of this section, that spouse will not be considered a stay-at-home spouse with little or no income. Any debts incurred during the marriage solely by one party and that were debts not incurred for health or basic needs, such as food or necessary clothing, not luxury clothing, must be paid by the party that incurred those debts without the consent of the other party. If the debts were incurred to meet necessary health or food expenses, including acupuncture or chiropractic or natural medicine that is effective in treating the health conditions that the one spouse refused to pay and could have paid for these debts will be considered health expenses that must be included in the alimony payments to the ailing spouse. Also, refusal to pay for the necessary health expenses of the ailing spouse will be considered a form of abuse as defined in this document, especially if there was a way these payments for the health care could have been made while the two were married. If one spouse claims that a health treatment is fraudulent and therefore he or she should not be required to pay for this, evidence must be shown that this treatment does not help the patient's condition or worsens it. And this evidence must be verified by health professionals knowledgeable about the treatment, who are licensed to perform this type of treatment, and who are qualified to make this assessment. No spouse will be penalized for failing health as a reason for failed monies or assets in the marriage, as long as the failing health was not caused by attempted suicide or mental illness or by extreme negligence. If one spouse or soon-to-be ex-spouse has a need for income that he or she could have earned if he or she retained his or her health during the marriage, that needed income will be granted to the spouse as much as is reasonably possible, and that won't debilitate the spouse who must pay. If the ill ex-spouse has enough of his or her income to take care of his or her health expenses, he or she cannot require the ex-spouse to cover any of his or her health expenses. This section is included in this document to prevent a marriage breakup solely due to a cold spouse who wants to dump his or her partner because his or her health expenses are getting too expensive for him or her. Where am I? Oh, however, once any ex-spouse remarries or has sex with any person other than his or her ex-spouse, the requirement to pay the health costs of that ex-spouse ends, and the ex-spouse is no longer responsible for the health costs of that ailing spouse who has become intimate with another besides his or her former spouse. If a spouse who is making health payments suspects that his or her ailing ex-spouse has had willing and knowing sex with another besides himself or herself, He or she must provide evidence that this is the case. The evidence cannot be based upon presumptions or because the two were alone in a dark room together. Maybe they didn't intend to be in the dark room together. And even if they were in the dark room together, it doesn't mean they had sex or that the sex was willing and knowing. Basically, the ex-spouse won't get out of the health care costs of the ailing spouse unless he or she can prove beyond any doubt that this ailing spouse has had willing and knowing sex with another besides himself or herself. If the marriage breakup is because the ailing spouse has had sex with another besides his or her spouse and was not driven to have this sex by an abusive spouse, no spouse is required to make any payments for the health problems of the unfaithful spouse. Both spouses are required to maintain or have some type of health insurance that covers most conditions and covers most catastrophic health care costs. If the couple live in a country like the United States, where health insurance is necessary for expensive health care costs for themselves and their children during the entire marriage. If they are financially unable to maintain the health insurance, the reasons for this must be noted and taken into consideration during the marriage breakup. But if health insurance could have been maintained and was not, no spouse will be responsible for health care costs of the spouse who could have maintained health insurance and did not. The amount of support granted to an ex-spouse who is awarded alimony for health impairment will be determined by how much this spouse could have earned if he or she retained his or her health during the marriage. No spouse will be awarded alimony or child support if that spouse does not need it to maintain a roof over his or her head or to maintain health or for basic needs. This thing is just basic needs. Or to pay the debts, or to pay debts or the cost of child care for a child that both spouses adopted or had through sex together after the marriage. Instead, the assets and monies will be divided as outlined in this document. If there is a dispute over the amount needed to maintain health or a roof over one's head, basic needs, or the cost of child care, it will be decided upon by the courts or by a legal arbitrator. However, in no case will any spouse be required to make any type of payments to either spouse if he or she lacks the ability to pay because he or she has not enough to maintain health or a roof over one's head, or because he or she, despite best efforts, fails to find work that pays him or her enough for alimony or child support. If there is a dispute over the ability to pay, this will be resolved by the courts or a legal arbitrator. No deadline can be imposed on any spouse to make payments who lacks the ability to pay until and if it is determined with certainty that that spouse now has the ability to pay. Okay, we're going to have to close pretty soon, and I'll have to go on to a third tape. Regarding children, any children born to the couple or adopted by the couple will be seen equally by both spouses after the marriage, or both parties can make other arrangements mutually agreed upon by both parties in writing with witnesses. The only exception will be if one of the spouses is abusive or criminal, then limitations must be placed on how much, if at all, the abusive or criminal spouse can see his or her children. If the child is old enough and has enough emotional strength and maturity to make the decision, he or she will decide which parents he or she wants to see or live with. If the child does not want to make this decision or is incapable of making this decision, then a psychiatrist chosen by Gerard Butler or Gerard Butler himself, a psychiatrist who practices in England and who played the Phantom in the Phantom of the Opera, will make the decisions about who should be granted custody of the child and how the visitation should be arranged. If Gerard Butler is one of the spouses in the dispute, then Gerard must choose as part of this prenuptial agreement about 10 psychiatrists or mental health professionals that can be used if there are any disagreements about custody of children after the dissolution of his marriage. Okay, we're going to have to cut it off.